31st of December 2023, Old Year's Eve. It's not evening yet. It's around about 11 o'clock in the Lowveld. And I've got a lot of thoughts about the year went past and about the next year. Now, for those that don't know, I'm a very keen baker, bread baker. For me, bread is something almost sacred. And when I write about bread, I usually type bread with a capital B. And the concept of daily bread is something that is in my mind most of the time. Now, to me, life is basically like baking bread. You have to go through some really rough punishment of that flour and water and yeast and dough, and you've got to hammer it, really panel beat that thing to get to a good bread. It is a fact that if you don't handle the dough firmly, your chances of getting a good bread is very slim. And that is how life is. We go through all these battles and getting bruised, but in the end, it is all that bruising that will determine what person you will be at the end of that baking process. Now, how many guys has asked me about bread, and I just want to give you a short description of bread for me. And it can be a very complicated and complex and time-consuming process, or it can be a short and sweet and fast process. If you want to bake a proper sourdough bread, like my grandmother used to do, you're talking about a long process. And most important in that process is the cultivation of that yeast plant. Now, some people do it with potatoes, other people do it with flour. The flour way is the traditional way, and that's how I do it. But it's a long process. To cultivate that yeast plant can take 7 to 8 days. And then when you do the actual bread, there is a lot of processes that you go through before you finally have a piece of dough that you can put into the oven. And in this day and age, very few people has the time, really has the time to do it like that. Now, in my quest to document the way my ancestors made food, I wrote a lot of stories about it, and I did a lot of investigation, and most importantly, I tried every one of those recipes, and I made those recipes, and I remade them until I succeeded. It's all available on my food blog. But the case of the sourdough bread was a massive challenge, and it took me about a year to perfect that process. And then at the end of that, I realized that there's not many people that's going to go through that. Although they would like to have that bread, they won't go through that process simply because there's no time. The alternative is to walk into the supermarket and buy a bread off the shelf there. And that's what most of us do. For me, I've got a health issue with that bread. First of all, I suffer from heartburn like hell, and that bread is not good for me. And if I mix that bread with coffee, I'm done. And that worried me, because when I was a youngster, a sandwich and coffee was a standard thing, and I never had a problem. This problem only started later in my life, and I was always trying to figure out why. And then I stumbled onto a paper that a professor in Italy wrote, and I realized, okay, there's the problem. The problem with the modern bread that we buy off the shelf is those things goes through a hell of a process that speeds up the whole bread making process. Where the traditional way for bread was, as I said, a long process. The modern factory bread is pushed through the steps like hell because they bake thousands and they cannot have bread sitting in a pan for 14 hours or something like that to rise properly. So it's a fast process. And there is the problem. But there is a way out of that problem. We all know these balls of dough, all of them. We know it. You buy them at the supermarket. Now, the only thing that you need to try and find out is whether your supermarket that sells these dough, in the flour that they use, try and find out whether it is bleached flour or unbleached flour. And if you can find, and there's many of these bakers, I must tell you, there's many of these bakers in the supermarkets that uses unbleached flour. And that is what you want, the unbleached flour. If you got the bleached ones, okay. You have the issue that there is chemicals in there that has been used to whiten the flour. Unbleached flour can be off-white towards a greyish color, but it's very, very subtle, very subtle. So just try and find out. I know for a fact that bakers at my spot, they use unbleached flour. So you buy a ball of dough like this, and most of us will make vetkoek with that, amagüeña, and many will make pizza with it, and a big favorite is to make what we call a pot bread, where this thing is baked in an cast iron pot, either in a fire pit or in an oven. And that's what people use this for. But in my house, for the past, I would say almost 5 years, I don't eat shop bread. I don't eat it. I bake my own bread and I use this dough. Now that might be a surprise to many, but that's the reality of life. Now, there's a few things, if you want the perfect loaf, there's a few things that you've got to do. And the first thing for me is this, the pan in which I will bake the bread. Now, you must see this bread tin, it's not a tin, it's a cast iron pot. You must see that as life. That is the world in which you exist in this world. That pan, that pot, that is that. And here is your life. That ball of dough. That's your life. Now, most people are scared of this ball of dough. Not scared, but they're very careful with the ball of dough. When they take this ball of dough out, they cut that bag open and they tip the dough out very carefully, and then they pick it up gently and they put it into the pan. And that's where you'll make your first mistake. This is what I do with that ball of dough. I flatten that thing out. You can see there. And the first objective is to try and get rid of all the gas bubbles that is in that dough. And this is where many guys will say, wow, okay, that's a problem. And this is life hammering you. But it is brutal, but it serves a great purpose, as you will see. So, on my worktop, I flatten it out and I work it with my fingers. To see that you can remove all the gas bubbles. If you look at this image, you'll see there in the left-hand corner, there is a bubble. And that bubble will be broken. This is how life hammers us and get rid of all the bubbles so that you can become a solid person, a dependable, solid person. Now this is what I did with that dough. And the next step is what is called in bread baking, we call this shaping the dough. Now that flat piece of dough has now been rolled up. And if you look carefully at that piece of dough lying on the desk there, tabletop there, you can see that the outer skin is stretched very tight. You want it as tight as possible. Why? It serves a few purposes. The first thing is, now that that dough has been shaped like that, and you have that tight skin around it, you will now trap all the gases that is produced by the fermentation process, because the flattening it and reshaping it will reactivate the yeast, and you will see it lying there tightly shaped. And when I put it in the pan, look at that. Look at all the space available in that pan. And now the novice is going to be very concerned, because if he tipped that piece of dough out of that plastic bag directly into this pot, it would have filled the pot basically wall to wall. And he feels good about it. He sees something like this, as I've shown you near, and his first instinct is, this is going to be a flop. But that is where you have to trust life. You have to trust nature. And we need to trust life after life has hammered us into this tight, solid ball with a tight skin. We are prepared for what is to come. And after a few hours, depending on temperature and humidity and whatever, this is what you will see in that pot. Look at that. That's 3 times bigger, maybe 4 times. I would say about 3.5 times bigger than that little tight rolled bowl that was placed into that pot. And this is how we grow in life. We grow and we have to fill our lives wall to wall. Because if you don't do it, it means that you've taken shortcuts somewhere with your life and your ducking and diving responsibilities and things like that. But this dough in the bread making, it's got nowhere to go. It does grow, but it's got nowhere to go. It must stay within that container. And it fills that container wall to wall. And that is how we grow in life. And it is important that the preparation was done properly, because if you look at this image, you will see, okay, the reason why it is filling that pot now is because through the yeast activity, gases are produced, and those gases are forming hundreds and thousands and millions of little bubbles in the dough. Each yeast molecule that works and eats on what is available in that flour creates its own gases, and that makes it small little bubbles. And you'll see it once you cut the bread. You will see what I'm talking about. But look on the left-hand side. The skin has torn there. It's not serious, but it has torn. And that is life. And that is what happens to us as we grow. We sometimes get tears in our skin. Part and parcel of the growth process. To some, that tear could be vicious. To others, it's just a small crack. But this is what happens to us. Now this dough is ready to go to the oven. Now what I do is I paint that loaf with milk. Just with a brush and milk, and then I spread sesame seed, this is poppy seeds. I've got poppy seeds on this one. Put poppy seeds on it. And that is for decoration. Yeah, it will give you a little bit of a taste, but it's mostly for decoration. And that is how our lives are. We do some things for functionality, because we have to do it, and we do other things just for the nice part of it, for it to look good and things. Now the oven has been preheated. In my case, I preheat my oven to 205 degrees centigrade. And I must say, I'm baking in a fan oven. So, that dough has been coated with the milk, and the seeds has been dripped on it. And now I'm going to put it into that hot oven. It is so important that that oven is very hot. Because what will happen, and now this is what is happening as far as the bread, and it's a technicality thing. The moment that that bread goes into that oven, that high heat will immediately start to harden this top part. That skin will get hard. And it is important for the process. That is why I painted with the milk, so that there's moisture on top there. That makes sure that that crust will seal as evenly as possible, as quick as possible. Why is that important? Because that will keep the gas that is now in that bread is going to get hot and it wants to escape. And that crust will prevent it from escaping too fast or too much. And that process of that gas trying to escape is what we call an oven spring. So you can see the bread is risen, the dough is risen, it's filled the pan properly to the brim, and then it goes into the oven. And this is what you get. Look at that. That bread is, you can see the edge where the pan, the rest of that head is outside the pan after the baking process. But there's a few things that I want you to take note of on this bread. If you look on the far side on the left, you'll see there where that tear was as we ended the rising process. Now that rising process is important, and that is part of our life. That's our growth period. That's where we grow, when we really grow. And you must be patient with that. You have to give that yeast time to develop properly. If you interrupt that, your bread that you bake will be tight, and it can be doughy. And if you allow it to rise properly, you will get a bread. You'll see when I cut this bread. But I need you to take note of that little, let's call it a scar on the left there. But here on the foreground, look at this. And this is now again technically important. Can you see there that bread, that tight dough skin that you achieved when you shaped it, kept the gas and everything in to make the dough rise properly. But then when the heat of the oven came into play, you get what I said, the oven spring, that's that final rise. And that oven spring was so successful that it tore the loaf. You will never see this on a factory bread, never. But you must understand, I started off with factory dough, and it is the baking process that makes the difference. Now that if you can see that stretch on the side, you know you've had a perfect bake. You know that. And if you look tightly on this, you may see in the crust small little bubbles. Now that little bubbles there is the seal of approval for a good baker. Without it, there's nothing wrong with the bread. But to a good baker, those bubbles, that's the medals. And many guys try to get it, and there is some tricks to get it. But the most important thing is very hot oven, and that milk that I painted onto the top, because that moisture there, combined with that huge heat, blisters the skin. And those are little blisters. I will show you another picture of another bread in which those blisters are more prominent. But to stick to the story here, you can see this is what you should strive for in your life. Although you go through all that hammering and beating of the dough, you need to strive to be this loaf when the baking process is over. There you are, ready for the next phase of your life. What is the next phase? The next phase in the life of a bread is this. There I've sliced it. Now there's things to look at in this slice. You can see the little holes and bubbles there. That is from the yeast rising, in the rising process. Tell you it was a successful rise. But if you look carefully, you will see that those little bubbles are evenly throughout that whole slice. That means that bread has been baked right through. And the magic of baking your own bread is I bake for 42 to 45 minutes at that temperature in that specific type of pan, and then you take it out and tip it out and put it on a wire rack to stand and cool off. It is very important that you don't cut that bread within 30 minutes. You must leave that bread alone. Don't put a cloth over it, nothing. Just let it stand there, because that bread is still baking. And sometimes when you stand close to it, you can hear it cracks. There's cracking sound in that bread as you tipped it out of the pan, and it starts to cool off. The bakers call that the bread, they say the bread is singing. Now if you can get that bread to sing, you know it was a perfect bake. Now, but that's just a little bit of trivia. But here is the slice, and this is in our lives. We went through that process of hammered and battering and bruising and rolling and eventually baked, and we come out a perfect loaf. But that loaf is not a display. That loaf has a purpose. And you slice that slice, and now you're starting to feed yourself and people. So your achievements in life must be dished out and feed other people so that they can grow. Now, for me, I'm a guy that likes butter. I don't eat the margarine and so forth. This is a spread that is made by the Lady Smith operation down in the Cape, and it is pure butter mixed with canola oil, and I like it because it makes it spreadable. Solid butter, yes, is great, but everyone knows to try and work with butter coming out of the fridge is a nightmare. So this is the spread I use, and for health reasons, for me it's fine because it's butter and canola. And I happen to know one of the people that was involved in the development of this product. And there is the slice. In my case, I lay the butter on thick. And in life, that is what I am. I like to share my experiences. And I share it well buttered to make it tasty, extra tasty. This is how I butter a loaf of bread, a slice of bread. And whenever I put butter onto my bread, I remember my dad telling me that after the war, he was staying in a boarding house, and when they were sitting down for meals, the waiter will come in with the bucket of butter. But he will walk out of that kitchen door into the dining hall and say, butter, 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 no butter, take away the butter. Before anyone could say a word, butter is gone again, because it was scarce. So I spread the butter well. And in this case, I went luxurious. There were leftover prawns from Christmas evening, and I put some homemade apricot jam on it, apricot jam that I cooked myself, and some of that prawns. And it was fantastic. And this is what life is. We go through that battering process of the dough and all of that, and eventually we're a perfect bread, and then we must start serving our purpose. That is when we start slicing and making sandwiches or open sandwiches and sharing, spreading our experience, spreading what we have to give to society. And this is how I see life. One of my social media profiles, the slogan I have in there is, let's bake this world better one loaf at a time. Now I'm going to show you, this is just technical, the story is over. This is a bread that I've made from exactly the same dough. And this is now for those that are adventurous. I buy that ball of dough and then I leave it in my fridge for 4 to 5 days. And from that big ball, it will collapse over the 5 days until it's just a flat piece of dough lying at the bottom of the packet. And when you cut that packet, you will smell it is sour. Now what happened? We've taken a shortcut to sourdough bread, because by leaving that bread, that dough, in that fridge for 4 or 5 days, you've allowed that dough to go through a fermentation, a natural fermentation process. That fermentation process that's part and parcel of baking sourdough bread. What happens in that 4 days, 4 or 5 days? The yeast it's a cold fermentation, so that yeast works very slow. And in that fermentation period, that yeast starts to break down the gluten in the dough, the gluten. And that gluten is turned into a more simple form of gluten. And the yeast is devouring basically every piece of sugar in that dough. And that is the reason why shop factory bread gives you heartburn, especially if you use it and you drink coffee with it. Because that fast fermentation process does not allow the yeast the time to do the modification to the gluten and take all the sugar out. Now, you're going to look at that piece of dough in that bag and you're not going to be very optimistic. Because that, first of all, it's going to feel very wet. And it's going to smell sour. Trust me, handle that thing properly. Go through the same process. The only difference is it can take 5 to 6 hours to rise. And it will not rise that pot of mine full. It will go up to about 2/3. And then I bake. And when I bake, it will most probably reach the top of the pan, or it will go a little bit over the pan. So it will be a little bit denser. But the taste is something that you cannot believe. And the chances of that bread to give you heartburn is extremely low. Especially if you're a guy with a sensitivity to and a tendency to develop heartburn from bread. Try it. All it will take is time. But now look at this loaf. You can see there is the oven tier is there on the side, which tells you that that loaf has risen properly and it took full advantage of the oven spring. But now look at how many of those blister bubbles is there. And it's because of the age of that dough that happens. Now, I'm a guy that don't like a pale bread. I like a bread with a decent dark crust. Many people don't like it like that. That's how I like it. I like that crispy crust. But whenever I bake bread, I think of my dad. And as I said, when I spread a slice, I think of him and his butter, butter, butter joke. And my dad was that was one of his special treats in life, was a tomato sandwich. So when I bake a bread, I'll cut the first end piece off, and then the first 2 slices I turn into a tomato sandwich. And this is how I do it. And if you look at this image here, look at the crust. That's what I like. I like a crust like that. If you don't want it like that, you must make the oven a little bit cooler, but don't interrupt the baking time, because it takes roughly about 40 to 45 minutes for a bread to bake properly. In any case, so you can see the crispy crust there. There's the tomato, plain butter, tomato, salt and pepper. And this is the end result. And I salute my father every time I make a sandwich like this. And for me, it is as if he is still giving to my life. And to end this story, this is what I do with that first slice. Butter, peanut butter, and apricot jam. And just for the joke and the hell of it, some trivia, when I put the peanut butter on, I take my salt mill and I spread some crushed salt onto that peanut butter, and then I put the jam. But that's it. All of us, we take life and we change life to our taste. But we must always be careful that we don't make it so exclusive for us so that nobody can share in it. I hope you have a great last day of 2023. Look around and see the things that you can be thankful for. And try and bake a bread. You will be surprised. There's magic in bread. Have a great day. Please give me a like and a subscribe and share the thing. And I want to thank the people that are supporting the channel financially. I really appreciate that. Have a great day.